The year was 1942. Across the Pacific, smoke rose from Pearl Harbor's ruins. And in Washington, one man's signature would change the lives of over 100,000 American citizens. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat behind his desk in the Oval Office. The same hand that had once signed the New Deal into existence, bringing bread, jobs, and hope to millions, now trembled slightly as it pressed pen to paper. Executive Order 966, a few strokes of ink justified by national security, but destined to stain the nation's conscience for generations. Radio stations carried his voice across the country, steady, confident, reassuring, the voice that had lifted a broken nation from the Great Depression. But outside, fear was louder. Newspapers screamed Japanese spy rings, and the American public, gripped by panic, demanded protection at any cost. In California, posters appeared overnight on street corners, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. Families had 6 days to pack what they could carry. They sold homes, farms, and dreams for pennies, boarding buses and trains bound for unknown destinations surrounded by barbed wire. And while trains departed westward, Roosevelt's approval ratings soared. To many, he was the savior, the man who defeated despair and would soon defeat fascism. To others, he had become something else entirely, a symbol of the danger that comes when fear hands absolute power to a single pen. History remembers Franklin D. Roosevelt as the president who gave America courage. But beneath the triumph lies a question few dare to ask. How far can a democracy go before saving itself becomes the act that betrays it? Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency was a paradox of light and shadow, the embodiment of both America's greatest recovery and one of its darkest betrayals. When he took office in 1933, the country was collapsing. Banks failed, unemployment soared past 20%, and faith in democracy itself was eroding. Roosevelt's New Deal rescued a desperate nation by reinventing the role of government, expanding federal authority to rebuild the economy and restore hope. Yet, the same man who became the face of compassion also wielded extraordinary power without hesitation. The New Deal's promise of collective security gradually blurred the line between leadership and control. When World War II erupted, that same executive power, once used to feed the hungry, was now used to imprison the innocent. The story of Franklin D. Roosevelt is not simply about a president. It is about the American soul under pressure. It's about the price of trust in moments of fear, and how moral clarity bends when survival feels uncertain. In Roosevelt's hands, power became both salvation and seduction, and America learned that even its most beloved leader could cross a line drawn not by enemies, but by his own conviction. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born into privilege, a world of Hudson Valley estates, private tutors, and the legacy of old money that defined early American aristocracy. Yet behind the silver spoon was an upbringing steeped in duty. From an early age, he absorbed the idea that those born fortunate carried the burden of stewardship, to lead, to govern, to protect. Educated at Groton, then Harvard, Roosevelt was molded by institutions that taught confidence more than humility. He admired his distant cousin Theodore Roosevelt, another president who believed in bold government and moral courage. Young Franklin studied him closely, not just the politics, but the posture of leadership itself. His ascent was steady until fate intervened. In 1921, polio struck him at age 39, paralyzing him from the waist down. It was, by all accounts, the end of his political future. But Roosevelt refused to vanish into despair. The struggle against paralysis forged a resilience no privilege could buy. Every painful therapy, every moment of isolation, deepened his empathy for those who suffered silently, the unemployed, the hungry, the forgotten. By the time he returned to public life, Roosevelt was not the same man. He had seen what helplessness felt like. That understanding became the moral foundation of his presidency. When he spoke in his famous fireside chats, he wasn't addressing citizens as subjects of government. He spoke as one of them, reassuring them that no crisis was beyond human endurance. In 1932, as the Great Depression consumed the country, Roosevelt rose as the voice of renewal. His campaign promise, a new deal for the American people, was both slogan and prophecy. To millions, he was not just a politician, but a lifeline. But beneath the warmth of his smile and the confident cadence of his speeches, there lay a steely strategist. Roosevelt understood the machinery of power and how to wield it. His disability had taught him patience. Politics taught him control. He would become, over the next decade, the most powerful president the United States had ever known. A man whose compassion and command were inseparable, and whose belief in government as a force for good would redefine the American state itself. When Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the White House in March 1933, America was teetering on collapse. Banks had shut their doors, unemployment had crippled entire cities, and the national mood was one of exhaustion and despair. Roosevelt, wheelchair-bound but unbowed, understood that leadership was no longer about persuasion. It was about reconstruction. He surrounded himself with a cadre of reformers, economists, and idealists, the so-called brain trust. They weren't traditional politicians, but intellectual engineers of a new social contract. Together, they designed the New Deal, a sprawling experiment that would touch every corner of American life. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the Social Security Act, the Works Progress Administration, these were not just programs, they were signals. Roosevelt was telling the American people that the federal government would no longer stand apart from suffering. It would intervene, invest, and if necessary, command. But every expansion of power came with a cost. The Supreme Court initially resisted his sweeping reforms, striking down major pieces of the New Deal as unconstitutional. Frustrated, Roosevelt launched what became one of the most controversial political maneuvers in U.S. history, the Court Packing Plan of 1937. His proposal to expand the Supreme Court and appoint new justices loyal to his vision ignited accusations that he was undermining the separation of powers. In private, Roosevelt was unapologetic. "They say I've become a dictator," he told aides, "but if I must use dictatorship to save democracy, I shall." That sentiment revealed the paradox at the heart of his rule. Roosevelt believed deeply in democratic ideals, yet he trusted himself more than the system to defend them. His confidence in his own moral compass allowed him to justify extraordinary authority. The press adored him, labor unions worshipped him, and his fireside chats made him a voice inside every home. But within Washington's marble halls, power was tilting. Congress, once the engine of governance, now revolved around the Oval Office. Roosevelt had turned the presidency into the central nervous system of the nation. By the late 1930s, he had built a political coalition that seemed unbreakable. Farmers, workers, minorities, and liberals united by faith in his vision. Yet beneath this harmony, a darker current was forming. As Europe drifted toward war and the drums of conflict echoed across the Atlantic, Roosevelt began to wield executive power with less restraint and more instinct. The mechanisms he had built to fight economic collapse were now repurposed for global war. And soon, the man who had mastered democracy's machinery would test how far it could bend before it broke. By 1941, Roosevelt stood at the summit of power. He had tamed the Great Depression, secured unprecedented electoral victories, and guided America from despair to defiant optimism. Yet even as he promised peace, the winds of war were gathering. On December 7, 1941, Japan struck Pearl Harbor. The attack shattered isolationist illusions overnight. Congress declared war within 24 hours, and Roosevelt, the wartime commander, emerged with near absolute authority. The same executive pen that had signed the New Deal's reforms now commanded armies, industries, and the hearts of 130 million citizens. But fear, that silent contagion, crept into the fabric of the nation. Military officials and some members of Congress began to warn of a Japanese fifth column on the West Coast. Newspapers amplified the paranoia. Polls showed that a majority of Americans supported removing people of Japanese ancestry from sensitive areas. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover opposed the idea, insisting there was no evidence of organized espionage. But voices like General John L. DeWitt insisted, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not." That statement, born of ignorance and hysteria, reached the president's desk. And on February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9DL66. With one act, he authorized the military to designate exclusion zones and remove anyone they deemed a threat. In practice, it meant the forced relocation of over 110,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them U.S. citizens, from their homes to internment camps scattered across the interior. Families were given days to sell property, close businesses, and pack a single suitcase. Photographs from the time show children wearing numbered tags, mothers clutching blankets, fathers staring into the distance with a silence too heavy for words. The War Relocation Authority called them evacuation centers. In reality, they were prisons behind barbed wire. Dust storms swept through rows of tar paper barracks in Manzanar, Topaz, and Heart Mountain. Entire communities disappeared overnight, replaced by ghost towns. And through it all, Roosevelt said little. Privately, he saw the decision as a necessity, a temporary wartime measure, nothing more. Publicly, he focused on unity, victory, and the march toward freedom abroad. But to those inside the camps, America's freedom had become an abstraction, spoken of by a government that no longer trusted them. Meanwhile, the New Deal state, the vast machinery Roosevelt had built, enabled the policy to function efficiently. Bureaucracies that had once administered relief now organized displacement. The same administrative genius that fed millions during the Depression now managed the logistics of internment. It was this duality that defined Roosevelt's presidency, the ability to wield compassion and coercion with the same steady hand. As war raged in Europe and the Pacific, America's moral compass quietly tilted. The Supreme Court upheld the internment in Korematsu v. United States, 1944, ruling that the government's wartime powers justified the exclusion. History would later condemn that decision and the silence that followed. Roosevelt's defenders argue he acted under unimaginable pressure, facing threats that demanded absolute vigilance. His critics say he surrendered to fear and prejudice. Both are right, and both miss the larger truth. Franklin D. Roosevelt was not merely a man of his time. He was the architect of modern executive power. He believed that in moments of crisis, democracy could not afford hesitation, and so in the name of protection, he redrew the boundary between liberty and authority, a line that America has wrestled with ever since. Executive Order 9066 was not an isolated act of wartime fear. It was the logical extension of a presidency built on the idea that government could and should reshape society in moments of crisis. To understand its consequences, one must trace the DNA of Roosevelt's own political philosophy. The New Deal had already normalized federal intervention on an unprecedented scale. For the first time, Washington was not a distant overseer, but an active participant in daily American life. The state built roads, paid wages, managed banks, and regulated prices. Bureaucracy became a lifeline, but also a habit. By 1942, the administrative machine Roosevelt had engineered could mobilize millions overnight. It could also, with the same precision, displace an entire population. In practice, Executive Order 9066 functioned through layers of civilian and military bureaucracy. The War Department drew up exclusion zones. The Western Defense Command executed removals. The War Relocation Authority constructed and managed 10 major camps. Every form, every train manifest, every numbered tag attached to a suitcase bore the quiet efficiency of the federal state in motion. This was the paradox of Roosevelt's legacy. The same system that embodied America's compassion during the Depression became an instrument of repression under the pressure of war. The moral calculus had shifted, from saving individuals to safeguarding the collective. Fear had redefined virtue. Economically, the New Deal succeeded in stabilizing the nation and paving the road to wartime prosperity. The internment, however, inflicted deep economic scars. Japanese Americans lost farms, homes, and small businesses worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Entire generations saw their economic and social capital erased. Politically, Roosevelt's decision consolidated the idea of executive supremacy in times of emergency. Congress deferred, the courts complied, public opinion, softened by propaganda and patriotism, accepted extraordinary measures as the price of safety. The notion that liberty could be suspended, temporarily, rationally, even benevolently, became part of America's political vocabulary. And yet, history would prove the fallacy of that logic. No act of sabotage by Japanese Americans was ever uncovered. No espionage ring was found. What remained was not evidence of danger, but evidence of prejudice, and a lesson about how democracies can fracture not from foreign enemies, but from the weight of their own fear. The consequences endured long after Roosevelt's death. It took more than 4 decades for the United States to formally apologize. In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act, signed by President Ronald Reagan, acknowledged the injustice and offered reparations. The bill's preamble called the internment a result of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Those words, though written decades later, were an indirect indictment of Roosevelt's decision, and a reminder that even the most heroic chapters in history cast shadows. Franklin D. Roosevelt built the modern American state. But in doing so, he left behind a question that still haunts its foundations. Can a nation expand its power to protect freedom without eventually turning that power against freedom itself? Controversy surrounded Franklin D. Roosevelt long before the internment camps. To his admirers, he was the man who saved democracy from collapse. To his critics, he was a political magician, dazzling the public with reforms while quietly accumulating unprecedented control. The first major wave of opposition came during the New Deal. Conservative senators, business leaders, and newspaper magnates accused Roosevelt of turning America toward socialism. The Chicago Tribune warned that he was laying the foundation for a permanent dictatorship. The American Liberty League, backed by corporate giants like DuPont, waged a relentless campaign against his policies. They saw the alphabet agencies, the NRA, WPA, AAA, not as tools of recovery, but as instruments of centralization. Roosevelt's response was as strategic as it was audacious. He reframed every attack as proof that entrenched elites feared progress. His political genius lay in transforming opposition into momentum. But the Supreme Court was less forgiving. In 1935 and 1936, several New Deal programs were struck down as unconstitutional. Furious, Roosevelt attempted his now infamous court packing plan, proposing to expand the number of justices. Though he claimed it was to ease the court's workload, few doubted his true motive, to tilt the judiciary in his favor. The backlash was immediate and severe. Even allies within his party recoiled. For the first time, Roosevelt's aura of invincibility cracked. Then came World War II, and with it, a new dimension of controversy. While Roosevelt led the nation to victory abroad, his decisions at home began to draw quiet unease. Civil libertarians like Eleanor Roosevelt, his own wife, expressed moral discomfort with Executive Order 9066. The First Lady privately condemned the policy, arguing that we have no right to discriminate against loyal citizens. A handful of officials resisted the tide. Attorney General Francis Biddle and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover both warned the president that the mass removal of Japanese Americans was unnecessary. But political pressure, from the military, from Congress, from public hysteria, was relentless. Roosevelt, ever the pragmatist, chose unity over principle. Even after the war ended, the controversy did not fade. The 1944 Supreme Court case Korematsu v. United States upheld the constitutionality of internment, a ruling that would stand for over 70 years until it was finally repudiated. Roosevelt died in 1945 before the reckoning came. His admirers remembered him as the savior of democracy. His detractors saw a man who had proven how fragile democracy could be. Both were right. Franklin D. Roosevelt's legacy is a study in contradiction, a fusion of compassion and control, progress and peril. He rescued a broken nation from despair, yet left behind a moral scar that challenged its conscience for generations. The New Deal remains one of the most transformative experiments in American history. It redefined the relationship between government and its people, establishing social safety nets that endure today: Social Security, labor protections, public works, and the very idea that Washington bears responsibility for economic stability. Roosevelt's vision of a people's government set the foundation for modern liberal democracy, inspiring leaders across the world. But that same vision carried an undercurrent of danger. The expansion of federal power that made the New Deal possible also blurred the boundaries that protect individual rights. Executive Order 9066 was not an aberration. It was the shadow cast by the same machinery that had been built to save. The state's ability to do good, Roosevelt proved, was inseparable from its capacity to do harm. History has softened its judgment of Roosevelt, framing his mistakes within the urgency of war and the scale of his achievements. Yet the deeper lesson remains timeless. In moments of crisis, when fear masquerades as patriotism, even the most enlightened leaders can rationalize injustice. Roosevelt's internment policy serves as a warning about what happens when empathy yields to expediency, when the need to act swiftly eclipses the need to act justly. It is a reminder that the gravest threats to democracy often arise not from foreign enemies, but from the choices made in its defense. And yet, without Roosevelt, the America that emerged from the 1930s might not have survived at all. His courage, creativity, and defiance of orthodoxy redefined what leadership could achieve. He proved that government could be a force for compassion, but also taught, perhaps unintentionally, that no leader is immune to the temptations of power. Roosevelt's story endures because it reflects the paradox of democracy itself, that strength and virtue can coexist with fragility and failure. He left behind not perfection, but a question, one that echoes through every generation that inherits his republic. How much power should we give to those we trust most, and what will we do when they misuse it? On April 12, 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt's pen fell silent. He died in Warm Springs, Georgia, still writing to the world. His unfinished speech lay on his desk, its final words haunting in their simplicity. The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. Outside, a nation wept. Radio stations fell quiet, factories paused, and soldiers at distant fronts stood still to listen. The voice that had guided America through depression and war had gone, and yet its echo remained in every law, every policy, every citizen's expectation of what government could be. In the years that followed, historians would debate whether Roosevelt saved democracy or reshaped it beyond recognition. His New Deal became the blueprint for modern governance. His Executive Order 9066, the warning carved into its foundation. But perhaps the truth lies not in choosing between them, but in holding both. Roosevelt embodied the eternal tension between power and principle, the belief that leadership requires both compassion and ruthlessness, both vision and restraint. He showed the world that democracy can bend and survive, but never without cost. Today, when leaders invoke security to justify control, when fear threatens freedom's fragile balance, Roosevelt's shadow still lingers. It reminds us that greatness does not absolve a man from error. It only magnifies the weight of his choices. Franklin D. Roosevelt gave America hope. He also forced it to confront what hope demands in return.